Chapter 19, The River of Night. The Iron Ark was not gliding, it was clawing its way through the earth. Silas sat in the shadows of the rudder room, his back pressed against the vibrating hull. The air here was hot and smelled of burnt grease. Above his head, the massive hydraulic arm of the rudder piston moved back and forth with a bone-crushing sound. Clunk, hiss, clunk. Franklin sat opposite him, clutching his cane. The blind man's head was tilted, listening to the symphony of the machine. "We are deep," Franklin whispered. "The pressure on the hull. Listen to the rivets. They're singing a high C. We're at least 50 fathoms down." Silas looked at the bulkhead door leading forward. It was sealed. A small round window, thick with grime, offered a glimpse of the corridor beyond. It glowed violet. The star metal Volkov had poured into the hull wasn't just structural. It was conducting energy. The walls of the ship were pulsing like bruised veins. "We need to move," Franklin said. "If we stay here, we die of heat stroke. If we go forward, we face the crew." Silas stood up. He checked Barnaby. The dog was panting, his tongue lolling out, eyes wide and rimmed with red. The radiation, or the sickness of the metal, was affecting the animal. Silas patted the dog's head. "Quiet. Hunt." He moved to the door. He peered through the glass. The corridor was empty. Steam vented from loose pipes, creating a fog that rolled along the floor. Silas turned the wheel of the hatch. Crack! He stepped out on dew. They were in the steerage, the rear section. To reach the bridge, the head, they had to pass through the engine room, the heart, and the crew quarters, the gut. Silas led the way, hatchet in hand. Franklin followed, one hand on Silas's shoulder, the other tapping the floor lightly with his cane to check for open gratings. They moved through the violet fog. The heat increased. They were approaching the engine room. Silas heard voices, not shouting, chanting, "Feed the fire! Feed the stone!" He stopped at a mesh grating that overlooked the main boiler floor. He looked down. The scene below was a vision of hell. The stokers, the men shoveling coal, were naked from the waist up. Their skin was covered in weeping sores. Their hair was falling out in clumps. The star metal radiation was cooking them alive. But they didn't seem to care. They shoveled with manic energy, their eyes glowing with a fanatic, feverish light. "The violet sickness," Franklin whispered, smelling the scent of ozone and rotting flesh rising from the grate. "Volkov is burning his crew to fuel his escape." Silas watched a stoker collapse. The man fell face first onto a pile of glowing violet coal. He didn't scream, he just twitched. Another stoker walked over, picked up the fallen man's shovel, and kicked the body aside. "More!" the new stoker screamed. "The king demands speed!" Silas pulled back from the grate. His stomach churned. They had to cross this room. But the walkway above the boilers was exposed. He looked up. There was a bundle of pipes running along the ceiling. Insulated steam pipes. Silas pointed up. He grabbed Franklin's hand and placed it on the pipe. "Climb." Franklin shook his head. "I am 70 years old, Lieutenant. I cannot swing like a monkey." Silas looked around. He saw a maintenance trolley, a small metal cart on rails used to move parts along the catwalk. He pointed to it. He helped Franklin sit in the cart. He lifted Barnaby and put him on the old man's lap. Silas grabbed the back of the cart. He pushed. The cart rolled silently along the upper gantry. Below them, the stokers were too busy with their holy fire to look up. They crossed the inferno. The heat was blistering. Silas felt the eyebrows singe on his face. They reached the far side. The crew quarters. Silas stopped the cart. He helped Franklin out. Here, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. Too quiet. Bunks were stacked 3 high along the walls. Hammocks swung with the motion of the ship. But the men in them weren't sleeping. They were staring. Silas froze. A dozen crew members lay in their bunks, but they were too sick to move. The radiation had crippled them. They watched Silas and Franklin pass with glassy, dead eyes. One man reached out a hand. His skin was grey, peeling like old paint. "Water," he croaked. Silas hesitated. "Don't," Franklin whispered. "He's already dead." They kept moving. Suddenly, a door opened ahead of them. A figure stepped out. It wasn't a sick crewman. It was a watcher. One of the elite guards. He wore a gas mask and a thick leather apron to protect against the radiation. He saw them. He raised a steam pistol. Silas didn't have room to dodge. But Barnaby moved. The dog, maddened by the heat and the sickness, didn't bark. He launched himself like a missile. Bang! The steam pistol fired, missing Silas and hitting a pipe. A jet of scalding steam erupted. Hiss! Barnaby slammed into the watcher's chest. The man went down, screaming as the dog tore at his mask. "Barnaby! Off!" Silas signalled. Pulling the dog back, the watcher lay on the floor, bleeding from the neck. He fumbled for a whistle around his neck. He was going to raise the alarm. Silas stepped forward. He raised the hatchet, but Franklin was faster. The blind man stepped on the watcher's wrist, pinning it to the floor. Then, with a precise, brutal motion, he drove the tip of his whalebone cane into the watcher's throat. The guard gurgled and went still. Franklin adjusted his coat. "In the Navy," he said breathlessly, "we call that silencing the deck." Silas looked at the old man. He looked at the dog. They were a pack of killers now. They dragged the body into a bunk and covered it with a blanket. They reached the end of the crew quarters. The final bulkhead. The door to the command section. But this door was different. It wasn't a hatch. It was a heavy, reinforced vault door. And it was guarded. Not by men, by sound. Silas peered around the corner. 2 automated turrets, brass contraptions powered by steam and clockwork, were mounted on either side of the door. They swiveled back and forth, their lenses glowing violet. "Clockwork sentries," Franklin whispered, hearing the gears. "Volkov's toys. They track motion." Silas looked at the turrets. Then he looked at the steam pipe the guard had shot earlier. It was still leaking. He had an idea. He looked at Franklin. "We need a distraction," Silas thought. He took the dead guard's steam pistol. He handed it to Franklin. He guided Franklin's hand to aim at a fire extinguisher tank on the far wall. "When I run," Silas signalled, tapping Franklin's shoulder. "Shoot," Franklin nodded. "I await your command, Captain." Silas took a breath. He sprinted. He dashed across the corridor. The turret swiveled instantly. Whir, click. Franklin fired. Bang! The bullet hit the extinguisher tank. Boom, whoosh! A cloud of white chemical foam and gas exploded, filling the corridor. The turrets fired blindly into the cloud. Rat-tat-tat-tat, steam-powered machine gun fire. Bullets sparked off the walls. Silas slid under the fire of the first turret. He swung his hatchet. Clang! He severed the steam hose powering the turret. It drooped, lifeless. He rolled. The second turret tracked him. Barnaby barked from the shadows. The turret swiveled toward the dog. Silas threw the hatchet. Crash! The hatchet smashed the lens of the second turret. It spun wildly, firing into the ceiling, then ground to a halt. Silence returned. Silas retrieved his hatchet. He went to the vault door. It was locked. But through the thick glass porthole of the vault, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The room beyond wasn't the bridge. It was the cargo hold. And inside were hundreds of glass tanks. And inside the tanks, floating in green fluid, were lampreys. Star metal lampreys. Volkov wasn't just escaping. He was bringing an army of biological weapons to the surface. Silas stared through the thick glass porthole of the vault door. His breath fogged the glass, but the horror on the other side was clear. It was a laboratory of nightmares. Rows upon rows of glass cylindrical tanks filled the cargo hold, bathed in an eerie green phosphorescence. Inside each tank, suspended in a nutrient gel, curled a star metal lamprey. They were larger than the one Silas had fought in the lake, some as thick as a man's torso. Their skin was translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with the same violet light as the ship's hull. They were growing. "What is it?" Franklin whispered, sensing Silas's rigidity. "What do you see?" Silas couldn't explain. How do you describe an army of mutant parasites to a blind man? He took Franklin's hand and pressed the old man's palm flat against the thick glass of the porthole. Franklin frowned. He concentrated. "Vibration," Franklin murmured. "Thousands of them. Small, slithering life signs. Like eels in a barrel." He pulled his hand back as if stung. "The samples," Franklin realized, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "Volkov didn't just want the metal for fuel. He's breeding them. He's taking the infection to the surface. If this ship reached the ocean, these things would be unleashed into the Atlantic ecosystem. It wouldn't just be a war. It would be a plague." Silas looked at the vault door. It was solid iron, sealed with 4 heavy locking bolts. The hatchet would be useless against it. "We need to get through," Franklin said, tapping his cane decisively. "If we sink the ship, we destroy the cargo." How to open, Silas thought. He looked around the corridor. He saw the steam pipes running along the wall, high-pressure lines feeding the destroyed turrets. He looked at the locking mechanism of the door. It was hydraulic. Silas had an idea. He pointed to the steam pipe. He mimed chopping. Then he pointed to the door lock. Franklin understood the physics instantly. "Superheated steam," Franklin nodded. "If you sever the line and direct the jet onto the hydraulic seal, the thermal shock might shatter the locking pistons. It was dangerous. If the steam hit them, it would flay the skin off their bones." Silas grabbed a thick woolen blanket from a nearby bunk, where a dead crewman lay. He wrapped it around his head and arms. He motioned for Franklin and Barnaby to get back around the corner. Silas approached the pipe next to the door frame. It was hissing angrily. He raised the hatchet. He didn't swing wildly. He aimed for the joint where the pipe met the wall. Clang. The pipe ruptured. Whoosh! A jet of invisible, superheated steam blasted out, hitting the door's locking mechanism point blank. The sound was like a screaming jet engine. The corridor filled with blinding white fog. Silas threw himself backward, rolling on the floor to escape the heat. The hydraulic pistons on the door screamed under the thermal stress. Cream! Ping, one bolt sheared off, then another. Ping, ping. The pressure inside the hold pushed the door open violently. Clang. The steam began to clear. Silas stood up, shaking off the hot droplets. The door was open. They stepped inside the cargo hold. The air here was humid, warm, and smelled intensely of ozone and raw copper. The green light from the tanks cast long, slithering shadows on the floor. They walked down the central aisle. It felt like walking through an alien cathedral. Barnaby whined, pressing close to Silas's leg. The dog refused to look left or right. On either side, the lampreys sensed their presence. They stirred in their tanks, their sucker mouths pressing against the glass, rows of teeth rasping silently. One tank near the centre was cracked. The glass was spiderwebbed. On the floor beneath it, a pool of green nutrient gel had leaked out, and lying in the gel was a lamprey. It wasn't dead. As they approached, the creature spasmed. It whipped its tail, slapping the metal floor. It was sluggish, suffocating in the air, but still dangerous. Silas stopped. He couldn't shoot it, the noise might alert the bridge. He couldn't hack it, the blood might make the floor slippery or attract others if tanks broke. "Careful," Franklin whispered. "I hear it thrashing on the deck." Silas guided Franklin around the creature, stepping delicately over the slime. Barnaby jumped over it with a terrified yelp that he managed to suppress into a squeak. They reached the far end of the cargo hold. There was a vertical ladder leading up through a hatch in the ceiling. A sign next to it read in Russian, "Komanny Mostik," Command Bridge. They had reached the head of the beast, Silas put a foot on the ladder. The rungs vibrated violently with the speed of the ship. Above them, through the closed hatch, they heard voices, shouting, and another sound. "Ping! Ping! Active sonar," Franklin said. "We're out of the subterranean river. We're entering the open ocean under the ice shelf." He gripped his cane tightly. "Volkov has almost won. Lieutenant, the final battle is upstairs." Silas looked up at the hatch. He checked his hatchet. He checked the old man. He checked the dog. He began to climb. He reached the top. He placed his hand on the hatch wheel. He turned it slowly, an inch. He pushed the hatch up just enough to peek through. Through the crack, Silas saw boots, heavy boots pacing back and forth on a brass grating. And beyond the boots, the great iron wheel of the helm and the giant silhouette of King Volkov. Chapter 20. The Helm of Madness. The hatch exploded upward. Silas didn't climb out, he erupted. He launched himself from the ladder, leading with his shoulder, slamming into the legs of the watcher standing guard over the hatch. Crunch. The guard went down. Before he could scream, Barnaby was on him, a snarling ball of fur and teeth. Silas rolled to his feet. He scanned the bridge. It was a brass cage of madness. Steam vented from ruptured pipes. Gauges spun wildly into the red. And at the centre of the storm stood King Volkov. The giant turned from the helm. He wasn't surprised. He looked delighted. "The diver," Volkov rumbled at, his voice amplified by the iron mask. "You survived the belly." He let go of the wheel. The ship lurched violently to port. Franklin scrambled up the ladder behind Silas. He stumbled onto the deck, swinging his cane to find his bearings. "The controls, Lieutenant!" Franklin shouted over the noise. "Find the ballast control." "We must surface before the hull crushes," Volkov laughed. He stepped forward, blocking the path to the control panel. He held a massive pipe wrench, a 4-foot bar of solid iron in his hand like a scepter. "Surface," Volkov roared. "No, we go deep, to the silence." He swung the wrench. Whoosh! Silas ducked. The wrench smashed into a brass telegraph, shattering it. Sparks showered the room. Silas scrambled back. He was fast, but the room was too small. Volkov lunged. He didn't swing this time. He punched. His massive fist, wrapped in a gauntlet of chainmail, caught Silas in the chest. Thud. Silas flew backward. He hit the periscope housing and slid to the floor, gasping. His ribs burned. The hatchet slipped from his hand. Volkov loomed over him. "You bring me the metal," Volkov said, raising the wrench for a killing blow. "Now you become part of the ship." Barnaby abandoned the fallen guard. The dog leaped at Volkov's back. Volkov didn't even turn. He swung his arm backward, backhanding the dog in midair. Yelp thud. Barnaby hit the bulkhead and slumped to the floor, unmoving. "No!" Franklin screamed. The blind man stood in the middle of the bridge. He looked helpless, frail, but he was listening. "Volkov," Franklin shouted. "The rivets are popping at frame 20. You have a hull breach in the bow." Volkov hesitated. The engineer in him listened instinctively. It was the second Silas needed. He didn't reach for the hatchet. He reached for his belt. For the chronometer detonator, the bomb Franklin had used in the cell. No, they used that. He reached for the bayonet, the rusty spike he'd taken from the Archangel. He lunged. He didn't aim for Volkov's armour. He aimed for the hydraulic hose connecting Volkov's steam assist exoskeleton, the backpack boiler powering his suit. Shh. The hose severed. Scalding steam erupted directly into Volkov's neck. Volkov screamed. He dropped the wrench. He clawed at his neck, trying to stop the burn. The powered suit seized up, locking his right arm in place. Silas scrambled past the giant. He grabbed Franklin's arm and threw him toward the control panel. The red lever, Silas thought, guiding Franklin's hand. Emergency blow. Franklin felt the panel. His fingers danced over the gauges. "Here," Franklin shouted. "Compressed air." He grabbed a lever, but Volkov wasn't done. The giant roared, fighting through the pain and the locked suit. He grabbed Silas by the back of the coat. He lifted the boy off the ground with one hand. "You little rat," Volkov hissed through his mask. He threw Silas, not at the wall, at Franklin. Silas crashed into the old man. They both tumbled to the deck, away from the controls. Volkov limped toward the panel. He grabbed the helm. He spun it hard to the right. "Dive!" Volkov commanded the ship. "Full down angle." The deck tilted steeply. They were sliding. Beep, beep, beep. "Hull integrity critical," Franklin wheezed, trying to stand up. "We are passing crush depth." The violet light in the walls pulsed faster, brighter. The ship was groaning in agony. Silas looked at his hatchet. It was sliding away across the tilted deck. He looked at Volkov. The giant was strapped to the wheel, laughing maniacally as the depth gauge spun. Silas looked at the emergency blow lever. It was 10 feet away, uphill. He couldn't reach it. But he looked at the periscope. It hung from the ceiling, a heavy steel tube, and right next to it, a chain hoist used for maintenance. Silas grabbed the chain. He looked at Barnaby. The dog was stirring, whimpering. Silas looked at Volkov. He climbed. He scrambled up the chain hoist, swinging like a pendulum over the tilted bridge. Volkov looked up. "Get down!" The giant reached for his steam pistol. Silas didn't get down. He unhooked the heavy iron block of the chain hoist. He swung. He wasn't aiming for Volkov. He aimed for the ballast control panel, specifically the glass covering the high-pressure air tank valve. "Fly," Silas thought. He let go of the heavy iron block. It swung across the room in a deadly arc. Crash. The block smashed into the panel, shattering the valves. It didn't pull the lever. It broke the pipe. The compressed air meant for the tanks exploded into the room. Boom! The force of the escaping air was like a bomb. It blew Volkov backward, slamming him against the helm. But more importantly, it triggered the failsafe. With the pressure line broken, the ballast tanks automatically purged. Whoosh! The ship stopped diving. It shuddered, and then it shot upward, like a cork released from the deep. The G-force slammed everyone to the floor. "Ascending!" Franklin screamed. "Too fast, we're going to breach." The ship rocketed toward the surface. Toward the ice. Volkov tried to stand. "No! Down! Down!" But the physics belonged to Silas now. The iron arc sped upward through the dark water. Above them, the frozen roof of the ocean awaited. Silas grabbed Barnaby. He grabbed Franklin. He braced against the periscope pole. "Hold on!" Crash! The ship hit the ice shelf from below. The conning tower smashed through the ice. The hull buckled, the bridge filled with snow, ice, and freezing air. Silence. Then, the groaning of the dying ship. Silas opened his eyes. He was alive. Snow was falling into the bridge through a gaping hole in the roof. He looked for Volkov. The giant was pinned. The helm, the wheel he loved so much, had been driven backward by the impact. It pinned Volkov against the bulkhead. The iron mask was cracked. Volkov wasn't moving, Franklin was coughing, covered in snow. "Lieutenant?" Silas crawled over. He tapped Franklin's hand. "Alive." Barnaby barked weakly. Silas stood up. He looked up through the hole. He saw the sky, a grey, twilight sky, and stars, real stars. But the ship was sliding. They had punched through the ice, but they hadn't landed on it. The ship was half in, half out, listing heavily. The stern was filling with water. "We have to go," Franklin whispered. "She's sinking." Silas looked at Volkov one last time. The king of the forge sat on his broken throne, staring at nothing. Silas grabbed his hatchet. He grabbed the pack with the map. He helped Franklin up the ladder, out into the snow. They climbed out of the wreck of the iron arc. They stood on the ice. Behind them, the submarine groaned, tipped, and slid backward into the hole it had made. Gurgle. Sloop. It was gone, taking the lampreys, the radiation, and the Mad King back to the abyss. Silas stood on the vast, white expanse of the Arctic Ocean. He was cold, he was battered. He was alone with an old man and a dog. But he was free. He looked west. In the distance, barely visible on the horizon, was the smoke of a ship. A real ship? A rescue ship? Or a whaler? Franklin sniffed the air. Coal smoke, Franklin smiled, tears freezing on his cheeks. Welsh coal, that is the Royal Navy. Sun, the search party. Silas looked at the smoke. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the bone harpoon tip, the only thing he'd kept from the offering. He dropped it onto the ice. The debt was paid. The hunt was over. He took Franklin's arm. He signalled to Barnaby. They began to walk toward the smoke. And so, the boy walked out of the legend and into history. Silas never spoke a word of what happened in the cradle. The Royal Navy found a blind officer, a mute boy, and a dog wandering the ice. They told stories of a mad Russian and a submarine. But the Admiralty locked the files. Some truths are too cold for the world to hold. Commodore Franklin returned to London a hero, though he never saw the sea again. He spent his days in a room full of clocks, drinking spruce tea, waiting for a guest who never knocked. And Silas? Some say he became a captain of his own ship. Some say he went back to the orphanage to burn it down. But the sailors in the North Atlantic tell a different story. They say when the fog rolls in, you can sometimes see a small boat, hunting not for whales, but for silence. The hatchet is buried, the ice is healed, but if you listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the ticking of the clock,